I'm 70 years old. Saying it out loud still sounds strange to me, as if age doesn't suit me, as if I had lived more for others than for myself. For a long time, I thought that getting older meant accepting everything in silence. Today, I realize that I accepted too much. And I kept quiet more than anyone should be silent. For most of my life, I believed what I was told. I believed it when they said it was normal. That it was just like that. That certain things are not discussed, they are just accepted. I believed it because trusting seemed easier than facing. Because disagreeing has always had too high a price for someone like me. I spent decades confusing silence with maturity. He thought that being quiet was a sign of strength, balance, wisdom. No one taught me that constant silence hurts too. No one warned me that swallowing feelings day after day charges high interest rates over time. When I look back, I see how many times I was ignored without realizing it. How many decisions were made about my life while I just nodded my head, even though I felt a knot in my chest. I smiled, thanked and moved on, believing that it was the right thing to do. I learned early on that raising my voice brings problems. I learned by watching, listening, feeling the mood change when someone dared to question. So I did what seemed safer, I kept quiet. I adapted. I molded myself to what was expected of me, even when it meant losing myself a little more each year. Time passed too quickly. When I realized, I had already built a whole life based on concessions. A marriage made of silences, relationships sustained by care, but not by dialogue. I was present, responsible, trustworthy, and invisible. There were days when I felt like talking. Many days. But there was always that inner voice saying that it wasn't worth it, that no one wanted to listen, that I was exaggerating. Then I swallowed it one more time, as I always did. And the world went on as if nothing was wrong. But something has changed inside me. It wasn't suddenly. It was an accumulated tiredness, a silent exhaustion. One day I woke up with the clear feeling that if I remained silent, there would be nothing left of me. Not even to remember who I was. That's when I realized, silence is no longer a choice. It became a prison. And for the first time in 70 years, I felt like I needed to do something different, even though I didn't know exactly how. Talking became less scary than remaining silent. This is the story of the day I finally said what everyone pretended not to see. Not to accuse, not to hurt, but to exist. Because even late, some truths still need to be told. The fact that you chose to be here, listening to this story now, already says a lot about who you are. What I'm going to share next is not only about my life, but about silences that many people carry without ever being able to name. If you believe these stories need to keep being told, sign up, because they're not just mine, they're ours. I was born in a simple house, one of those where everything had its place and no one asked much why things were. There was no lack of food, there was no lack of shelter, but there were no words left either. It was a home where silence was more common than explanations, and where learning to observe was more useful than learning to speak. My parents were not bad people. Today I understand this more clearly. They did what they knew how to do, the way they learned. But there were invisible rules in that house, and the main one was not to question. Those who obeyed were praised. Those who asked too many questions quickly learned to repent. Since I was little, I realized that certain questions made the environment heavy. A simple "why" was enough to change the tone of the conversation, the looks, the air of the room. So I learned to swallow curiosity, to hold doubts, to accept answers that never came complete. Keeping quiet was safer. The relationship with my mother was made up of practical care, but little listening. She did everything for us, but never asked what we felt. My father, on the other hand, believed that authority cannot be explained, it is imposed. He spoke little, but when he did, it was law. And no one discussed the law in that house. Money was counted. Life was simple. There was no room for drama, feelings, or fragilities. If something hurt, the orientation was to move on. If something bothered him, time would solve it. At least that's what they said. I learned early on not to bother anyone with what was going on inside me. At the dinner table, each one spoke as necessary. There were no long conversations, loose laughter, or deep exchanges. Silence was comfortable for them. For me, it became a habit. I observed, listened, and recorded everything in silence, as if that were maturity. Over time, I came to believe that my role was this: not to create problems, not to generate conflicts, not to be a burden. To be the easy child, which doesn't take work. And the more I fit into that, the more praised I was. It taught me that disappearing a little was approving. I don't remember long hugs or heartfelt conversations about fear, sadness, or dreams. These things had no place there. And, without realizing it, I learned that feeling too much was dangerous. That talking too much was wrong. That existing in silence was the best way. This house taught me a lot, but it also shaped me in a way that took decades for me to realize. There was born the man who always gave in, who always agreed, who always put others first. It all started in that silence that seemed normal, but that became heavy over the years. Today, looking back, I see that I didn't just learn to be quiet in that house. I learned to shut up. And this learning accompanied me throughout my life, even when it no longer made sense. In that house, love was never something that could be explained. It existed, I know it existed, but it was accompanied by silent rules. To love meant to obey, to respect without question, and not to create problems. No one said it out loud, but I felt it every day, in every restrained gesture and in every interrupted conversation. My parents believed they were preparing their children for the world. A hard, demanding world, where there was no room for weakness. But along with this idea came the absence of listening. No one asked what I thought or felt. It was assumed that I was fine as long as I did not complain. I quickly learned that feelings complicated things. When I showed sadness or confusion, the answer came short, practical, almost automatic. It passes. It's nothing. Stop thinking about it. Gradually, I understood that the best thing was not to feel too much. Or, at least, not to show it. My father rarely asked anything about me. He spoke of what needed to be done, what was right, what was expected. My mother listened more, but she didn't go deeper either. It solved concrete problems, not invisible ones. And so I grew up, with everything apparently in place, except me. There was no room for real conversation. Dreams, fears, and doubts were kept. I became an expert at looking good, even when I wasn't. I discovered early on that pleasing had fewer consequences than disagreeing. And that became part of who I was. Over time, I began to adapt to what was expected of me without even realizing it. He said yes before thinking. He agreed to avoid tension. He gave in to keep the peace. I thought this was maturity, when in fact it was fear of displeasing. The love in that house did not ask difficult questions. He didn't care if I was comfortable, only if I was obedient. And I played this role well. He was the correct, educated, responsible son. He received praise for it, and each compliment reinforced the idea that being quiet was the right way. Sometimes I wondered if something was wrong with me. Why did I feel an emptiness that I couldn't explain? Why did I have a hard time saying what I wanted? But these questions were also quickly swallowed up. Questioning too much was never encouraged. This kind of love shapes us in a silent way. It doesn't hurt all at once. He teaches, little by little, that his needs come later. That their wills are secondary. That your role is to fit in, not express yourself. When I reached adolescence, I was already trained. He knew exactly what to say, when to say it and, above all, when to keep quiet. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was familiar. It was safe. And without realizing it, I had already learned to disappear within the expectations of others. It was in this environment, where love didn't ask questions, that I began to believe that my voice wasn't needed. A belief that I carried with me for many, many years. I was still young when the first big decision happened that wasn't mine. I clearly remember the feeling of being present and, at the same time, completely absent. They talked about my future as if I wasn't there, as if my opinion was just an expendable detail. The voices were firm, sure, full of certainty. They said they knew what was best for me, that they were thinking about my good, that I was still too young to understand certain things. I listened to everything in silence, as I always did, trying to find some space to speak, but without the courage to interrupt. When I was finally asked something, it wasn't exactly a question. It was another confirmation of what was already decided. You agree, don't you? That accepted no other answer than a nod. And I waved. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't know how to disagree. I remember the tightness in my chest at that moment. A mixture of confusion, fear, and shame. I felt that something important was being taken away from me, but I couldn't name what. I had no words to explain the discomfort, so I did what I always did, I kept quiet. After that, everything started to be treated as normal. No one noticed my heaviest silence, my lost gaze, my difficulty sleeping. Or maybe they realized it and chose to ignore it. It was easier to move on than to question whether they had gone too far. The phrases came ready-made, repeated as absolute truths. That's just how it is. You'll thank you in the future. Everyone goes through this. Each word of these settled in me as an order to accept, not to feel and not to complain. Over time, I began to believe that resisting would be ingratitude. That questioning would be disrespectful. That feeling pain meant weakness. So I turned that imposed decision into something I pretended to have chosen. It was easier to deceive myself than to face the feeling of helplessness. From that day on, something changed inside me. Not in a visible way, but in a profound way. I started to doubt my own wishes. If they knew better than I did, who was I to want something different? This question began to follow me in silence. What hurt the most was not the decision itself, but the naturalness with which everything happened. As if it were obvious. As if I had no right to hesitate, feel, or refuse. My silence was interpreted as agreement, and no one went back to confirm. There, without me realizing it, I learned a lesson that I would carry for decades. My choices could be made by others, and I should accept them. It was at this moment that silence ceased to be just a habit. It has become the rule. And I obeyed this rule for many years, believing that there was no other way to live. After that decision I made, something began to echo inside my head like a repeated sentence. It was not a specific voice, nor an isolated moment. It was a fixed idea, reinforced every day, in small situations, always with the same words: "That's how it is." They said it as if closing a door. And I learned not to try to open it again. Whenever he showed any discomfort, even in a subtle way, the answer came ready. A tired look, an impatient sigh, followed by that short sentence that ended everything. There was no room for conversation, much less for questioning. That was not presented as an option, but as an immutable fact of life. At first, I was still trying to understand. I thought that, over time, things would make more sense. That one day I would wake up and realize that it really had been better this way. But the days passed, and the emptiness remained. A silent emptiness, difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. Gradually, I began to repeat these words to myself. When something bothered me, I thought, "That's how it is." When I felt like saying no, I corrected myself in silence. I told myself that I was exaggerating, that I needed to be more grateful, more understanding, easier to deal with. These phrases began to work as a kind of emotional anesthesia. They didn't solve anything, but they helped to endure. It was as if I was always preparing myself to hold on a little longer. Another concession. Another silence. Always believing that, at some point, it would be rewarded. What confused me the most was realizing that no one around seemed to find it strange. For them, everything went on normally. I was the same as always, polite, responsible, obedient. He received praise for not creating problems, for not complaining, for accepting everything calmly. And each compliment reinforced the idea that I was doing the right thing. Over time, I began to doubt my own perception. If everyone said it was normal, who was I to disagree? Maybe I was too sensitive. Perhaps he was seeing pain where there was none. This constant doubt began to erode something fundamental within me: confidence in myself. Whenever I thought about talking, the blame came first. Guilt for looking ungrateful. Guilt for questioning decisions made for my good. Guilt for feeling something that no one else seemed to feel. So I kept quiet before I even tried. Silence seemed less risky than the possibility of disappointing someone. I became an expert in adapting. I learned to shape my reactions, to control my impulses, to hide any sign of discomfort. On the outside, it looked like balance. Inside, it was just tiredness. A tiredness that did not go away with rest, because it did not come from the body, it came from within. This pattern has spread throughout my entire life. I started to accept situations that diminished me, relationships where I always gave in, choices that didn't reflect who I was. All in the name of peace, harmony, the idea that certain things simply cannot be discussed. Today, looking back, I see how much that simple phrase shaped who I became. That's just how it was. It wasn't just an explanation. It was a way to keep myself in place. And I stood there for decades, believing that enduring in silence was a sign of strength, when in fact it was just survival. After learning to accept everything as normal, growing up without a voice became something automatic. I didn't realize when I was giving in anymore, because giving in was already part of who I was. My choices began to happen on autopilot, always guided by what seemed most acceptable to others, not by what made sense to me. In my youth, while some learned to position themselves, I learned to adapt. I observed the environments, the people, the moods, and adjusted my behavior so as not to bother. He spoke as necessary, smiled when they expected a smile, agreed when the disagreement seemed too dangerous. There were times when I felt like saying something different, expressing an opposing opinion, but this desire was accompanied by an immediate tightness in my chest. It was as if my body already knew that talking would have consequences. So I would swallow the words before I had even formed them completely. Over time, I lost the reference of what I really wanted. When someone asked me my opinion, I answered based on what I thought that person would like to hear. It was easier that way. Less risk. Less conflict. But each time I did that, I moved a little further away from myself. The important decisions of my life began to happen without enthusiasm. I wasn't unhappy in a blatant way, but I wasn't whole either. Everything was lukewarm, contained, controlled. I followed safe, approved, socially acceptable paths, even though I felt that something inside me was left behind. People saw me as someone calm, balanced, reliable. And I believed that too. After all, I didn't fight, I didn't complain, I didn't create problems. What no one saw was the constant effort to maintain this image, the silent fatigue of always adjusting. Sometimes, at night, when he was alone, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. It was not deep sadness, but a lack. As if something essential was missing. I tried to understand what it was, but I didn't know where to start. I had never been taught to listen to myself. I started to confuse the absence of conflict with happiness. If everything was calm, I thought everything was fine. Even when I felt a persistent discomfort, I ignored it. After all, I learned that feeling too much was a problem. And I didn't want to be a problem. This quiet growth has shaped my relationships. I attracted people who decided, who spoke louder, who took up space. And I was behind the scenes, supporting, agreeing, sustaining. It felt natural, almost comfortable, because it was the role I knew. Only much later would I understand that growing up without a voice has a high price. At the time, I just kept going, believing that life was just like that. And without realizing it, I was building a future where my presence was constant, but my voice, almost non-existent. When I got married, I thought I was finally doing something right. Not because I felt a deep conviction, but because everyone around me approved. They said it was a good choice, that it made sense, that it was the natural next step. I agreed, as I always did, believing that maybe, this time, the sense of belonging would come with it. At first, everything seemed calm. I was attentive, present, willing to avoid any kind of conflict. I thought that was love. I thought that to love was to give in, to understand, to swallow small frustrations in the name of harmony. And as I already had experience in this, I played this role well. Over time, I realized that my desires rarely entered the conversation. Decisions were made naturally, almost without realizing it. Where to live, how to spend, what to prioritize. I listened, pondered in silence and agreed. Not because I thought it was better, but because disagreeing seemed unnecessary, tiring, risky. Whenever something bothered me, I tried to minimize it. I told myself that I wasn't that important, that every marriage requires compromise, that no one lives exactly as they want. These justifications helped me to continue, but they also took me away from what I really felt. My posture was creating a silent imbalance. I gave in so much that I stopped being consulted. My opinions became presumed, not asked. And I accepted this naturally, as if it were a logical consequence of who I have always been. Sometimes I felt a pang of frustration, but it was mixed with guilt. Guilt for thinking of me. Guilt for wishing for something different. Guilt for imagining that maybe I was living a life that wasn't exactly mine. So I would push those thoughts away and move on. The deepest conversations never happened. Not for lack of opportunity, but for lack of habit. I didn't know how to start. I didn't know how to say how I felt without seeming exaggerated or ungrateful. So she chose silence, believing that it would protect the relationship. On the outside, we were seen as a stable couple. No big fights, no scandals, no apparent conflicts. Inside, I felt more and more invisible. Physically present, but absent in decisions, desires, plans. This pattern was repeated for years. I adapted so much that I started to believe that it was normal. What a marriage it was, one adjusting more than the other. And since I've always been good at adjusting, I kept going. Today, looking back, I see that I did not lack love. I lacked a voice. And this absence was creating a silent void that grew along with time, waiting for the moment when I would finally have the courage to face it. When I became a father, I felt something different from anything I had ever experienced. For the first time, there was someone who depended on me not only to survive, but to learn what the world was. This thought scared me more than any previous responsibility, because I knew how to care, but I didn't know how to teach how to be free. I loved my children in a deep and sincere way. There was never a lack of presence, effort, or protection. I was there, every day, ensuring safety, stability and care. But there was something I didn't know how to offer, an example of one's own voice. I didn't know how to show how to position myself because I never learned how to do it with myself. Many times, I promised internally that I would do it differently from my parents. That he would listen more, that he would not decide everything for them. And, at times, I even succeeded. But I realized that silence is also transmitted. Even without harsh words, I taught by example that giving in was safer than confronting. When family conflicts arose, I tried to resolve everything in silence. He avoided arguments, eased tensions, agreed to keep the peace. I thought I was protecting my children, when in fact I was showing that discomfort is swallowed, not faced. There were times when they asked me what I thought of certain decisions. I answered vaguely, diverted, let others decide. It was not a lack of opinion. It was fear of making mistakes, fear of generating conflict, fear of leaving the role that I knew so well. Over the years, I began to feel a guilt that was difficult to explain. A feeling that I was present, but incomplete. That offered love, but not the whole truth. I wanted my children to be strong, but I didn't know how to teach them not to be silent. Sometimes, I observed their attitudes that reminded me too much of myself. The way they avoided conflicts, how they apologized without knowing exactly why, how they always put the wishes of others first. That hurt me more than any harsh words. I silently wondered if I was repeating a cycle. If, without realizing it, I was passing on what hurt me the most. But, as I always did, I pushed these questions away. Facing them would require a courage that I did not yet have. Being a father gave me love, but it also showed me limits that I didn't want to see. It showed me that I didn't know exactly who I was, and that it spilled over to those around me. Still, I kept trying the only way I knew how, doing the best I could, even in silence. Today, I understand that my biggest difficulty as a father was not the lack of care, but the lack of voice. And this absence was accumulating inside me, waiting for the moment when I would finally have the courage to break the pattern. Over the years, I realized that there was something constant accompanying me, even in the moments when everything seemed to be fine. It was not open sadness, nor open anger. It was guilt. A diffuse guilt, difficult to explain, but always present, like a weight that I carried without knowing exactly where it came from. I felt guilty about things small and big. Guilty for not being happier, guilty for wishing for something different, guilty for feeling tired of a life that, in the eyes of others, seemed right. This guilt did not scream, but whispered all the time, reminding me that I owed someone something. I often wondered what exactly I had done wrong. I fulfilled responsibilities, I was present, I avoided conflicts, I followed rules. Still, the feeling of being lacking did not disappear. It was as if I was always in debt for an explanation that I never knew how to give. This guilt accompanied me in my day-to-day decisions. Before I said no, I already felt wrong. Before choosing something for myself, I thought about who could be bothered. My choices were always filtered by the fear of disappointment, even when no one was asking me for anything directly. Over time, this guilt began to shape my identity. I saw myself as someone who needed to compensate, justify, balance. As if my existence required constant care not to bother. And so, I kept adjusting, diminishing myself, hiding. There were days when I woke up tired for no apparent reason. It wasn't the body that hurt, it was something deeper. A silent emotional exhaustion, accumulated by years of restraint. I didn't know how to name it, I just felt it. And, as always, he moved on. The people around me rarely noticed. I continued to function, fulfilling roles, being reliable. And precisely for this reason, no one suspected the weight I carried. After all, I never complained. I never gave clear signs that anything was wrong. Sometimes, I thought that maybe that guilt was normal. That everyone felt that. That it was part of getting older, of taking responsibility, of being an adult. So I accepted it once again, mentally repeating that it was just like that. But there were moments of silence, especially at night, when this guilt became heavier. I relived choices, unspoken conversations, decisions accepted without question. And an insistent question arose, always unanswered: at what point did I stop listening to myself? That guilt never went away because it was never faced. It just settled inside me, growing along with the years. And I continued to carry this weight, not knowing that one day it would be the first to unravel when I finally decided to speak. At some point along the way, my body began to show signs of fatigue that did not match the routine I was leading. I slept, but woke up exhausted. He rested, but the feeling of heaviness did not go away. It was not clear pain, it was not an evident disease. It was a silent exhaustion, difficult to explain even to myself. I kept working. I woke up on time, fulfilled commitments, talked normally. Those who saw me from the outside didn't notice anything different. But inside, there was a constant fatigue, as if something was always draining my energy without me realizing where it was coming from. Sometimes I would stop in the middle of the day and feel a strange urge to just be absolutely silent. Not talking, not thinking, not reacting. It was as if my soul asked for a break after so many years of adjusting, giving in and shutting up. I began to realize that this tiredness appeared mainly after situations in which I needed to swallow something one more time. A decision made without me, an expectation placed on me, a crossed word that I pretended not to hear. My body reacted to what my mouth didn't say. There were days when I would sit alone and stare into space, trying to figure out when everything had gotten so heavy. I couldn't pinpoint a specific moment. It was as if the accumulation of silences had, little by little, turned into this deep weariness. Even so, I avoided talking about it. He didn't want to worry anyone, nor to appear weak, nor exaggerated. Besides, I didn't know exactly what to say. How to explain a tiredness that did not come from physical exertion, but from a lifetime canceling itself out in small doses? I told myself it was age. That it was normal to feel this way at 70. That the body no longer responds as before. This explanation seemed convenient, because it freed me from the need to look deeper. And I accepted, once again, the easy answer. But there was something that didn't fit. I knew people my age who had a sparkle in their eyes, a desire to live, a firm opinion. And I, despite everything I had built, felt empty. Not sad all the time, but distant from myself. This fatigue began to make me think, albeit in a timid way. I began to wonder if the problem wasn't the body, but everything I'd carried in silence for so many years. Questions that I had always avoided began to arise, insistent. I still didn't have answers. But, for the first time, I began to suspect that this wear and tear was not just something I needed to endure. Maybe it was a sign. A belated warning that something inside me needed to finally be heard. I didn't expect it to be a simple conversation that moved me so much. There was no announcement, nor special atmosphere. It happened on an ordinary day, one of those that we believe will pass without leaving marks. And maybe that's why it was so powerful. Because it caught me off guard. We were sitting, talking about practical things, when someone commented something about me as if I wasn't there. It wasn't bad. He was not aggressive. It was automatic. A phrase said naturally, loaded with that old certainty that I would always accept. At that moment, I felt something different. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. A strange, almost uncomfortable lucidity. For the first time, instead of shrinking inside, I realized how much it was repeated. The pattern was there, wide open, and I could finally see it. Someone noticed my different silence and asked if everything was okay. This simple and late question opened something inside me. My first reaction was to deny it, as I always did. But the words did not come out. Something held me back. Or maybe something pushed me. I took a deep breath. My heart was pounding, as if I was about to do something dangerous. And, in a way, it was. Because speaking, for me, has always been risky. Even so, I couldn't go back that time. I said it wasn't okay. He said in a low but firm voice. It was the first time in a long time that I verbalized this without apologizing before. The environment became strange, silent, as if no one knew exactly how to react. It was not a long speech. I didn't have to explain everything. I just said that I felt constantly ignored, that decisions were made about me without being asked, and that it tired me. As I spoke, I felt my hands tremble, but I kept going. The most surprising thing was not the reaction of others, but mine. As I said those words, I felt something loosen inside me. As if I had carried a weight for too long and suddenly it slipped off my shoulders. Some tried to downplay it. Others diverted the subject. But one person looked at me differently. With real attention. And he said something that stuck with me. I had never thought of that side. That simple sentence opened a crack. When the conversation ended, I didn't know what would come next. But he knew one thing, something had changed. I had spoken. And, for the first time, I didn't feel wrong about it. What comes now is the hardest part to tell, because to talk about it means to expose something that I have spent my whole life protecting in silence. By sharing this moment, I give up the comfort of pretending it didn't hurt, and that comes at a real cost. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some truths need to be told so they don't erase us from the inside. So I ask you, subscribe, not as a support for me, but as a way to preserve this voice, and so many others that are almost never heard. After that conversation, something began to move inside me silently but persistently. It was not an immediate relief, nor a feeling of victory. It was more like a new restlessness, a question that I had never allowed to fully form. What if it was never my fault? This question accompanied me in the following days. He appeared when I woke up, when I walked around the house, when I was alone in silence. For the first time, I didn't push her away. I let it exist, even though it was uncomfortable. I began to revisit old memories with different eyes. Situations that I always interpreted as my failures started to seem different. No more evidence of weakness, but clear signs that I had been silenced, controlled, led without choice. I remembered how many times I was told that I exaggerated, that I felt too much, that I needed to be more grateful. And I realized how much these phrases shaped the way I saw myself. I had learned to distrust myself before I distrusted others. That realization hurt. It hurt to realize that I spent so many years trying to correct something that maybe was never wrong. That the guilt I carried was not born of real mistakes, but of imposed expectations, of decisions made without dialogue, of normalized silences. At the same time, there was a certain relief in this pain. Because, if it wasn't my fault, then I didn't have to keep punishing myself anymore. I no longer needed to justify everything, nor apologize for existing in my own way. I began to notice how my body reacted to this new way of thinking. He breathed a little deeper. He slept a little better. Not because everything was solved, but because something finally made sense. Still, the doubt was accompanied by fear. If I wasn't the problem, then what would I do with all of this now? How to live differently after a lifetime of being silent? These questions had no immediate answer, and I had to accept that. I started to observe everyday situations more closely. I noticed when something bothered me, and instead of swallowing it automatically, I recognized the discomfort. I didn't always speak, but I didn't deny it to myself either. It was in this silent process that I began to understand, acknowledging is not the same as confronting, but it is the first step. And, for me, this step was already huge. I was, for the first time, on my own side. The idea that perhaps I was not weak, nor ungrateful, nor exaggerated began to take hold slowly. Like a dim light in a dark room, still distant but visible. And I knew that, after that, it would be impossible to pretend that I didn't see it again. I knew that, at some point, I would have to speak again. After all that I began to see, the silence no longer seemed as safe as before. He had lost the function of protection and started to suffocate me. Even so, I didn't plan that day. It just happened. We were together, like so many other times. Cross-talking, decisions being suggested, comments made about me without being asked anything. All very familiar. All very similar to what it has always been. The difference was that, this time, I was attentive. When I realized that another choice was being made by me, I felt that old impulse to shut up. My body reacted as it always has. The heart raced, the throat tightened, the desire to disappear appeared. But something in me refused to obey. I took a deep breath, not to gain courage, but not to back down. And then I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt anyone in anger. I just said I needed to say something before they continued. The silence that formed was immediate and heavy. My hands trembled, but my words came out clear. He said that I always let them decide for me, but that didn't mean agreement. He said that my silence was never comfort, it was tiredness. And that carrying this for so many years had made me sick. Some looked on in surprise. Others looked away. There were those who tried to laugh, soften, change the subject. But I kept going. For the first time, I did not apologize for speaking. I didn't ask permission. I just kept saying what needed to be said. I explained that I didn't want to fight or point blame. I just wanted to be considered. I wanted to be heard before they decided things that concerned my life. He said this calmly, but firmly. A firmness that I myself did not know. As I spoke, I felt something strange happen inside me. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled. For the first time, he shared space with a new feeling, dignity. I was respecting myself, even without knowing what the price of this would be. When I finished, no one answered immediately. The silence returned, but it was different. It was not the usual silence, comfortable and convenient. It was an uncomfortable silence, full of unspoken things. And, interestingly, I felt lighter inside him. A few minutes later, someone tried to justify old behavior. Another said he never meant to hurt me. I heard everything, but I didn't go back. I didn't need to convince anyone anymore. I had already done the hardest. That day, I didn't solve everything. Some relations became strained. Others began to change. But one thing was certain, I had crossed a line of no return. I had spoken. And for the first time in 70 years, I didn't feel invisible. After I finished speaking, the environment became strange in a way I had never experienced before. It was not discussion, nor open confrontation. It was a heavy, uncomfortable silence, as if everyone was trying to reorganize something that had gone out of place. For the first time, that silence was not mine. He belonged to everyone. I remained seated, feeling my heart beating strongly, waiting for some harsher reaction. Part of me was still prepared for rejection, for judgment, for the accusation of ingratitude. But none of this came immediately. There were aside-led looks, long sighs, and a general attempt to act as if everything could go on as normal. Someone changed the subject. Another began to talk about something banal, as if he were trying to fill the void that had opened up. I listened, I participated little, but I didn't hold back. I no longer felt the urgency to fix the climate, as I always did. That tension was no longer just my responsibility. In the following days, I noticed subtle changes. Some people walked away. Conversations became shorter, visits rarer. There was no open fight, but there was a new, silent distance. That hurt more than I care to admit. The fear of being alone came back with force. There were times when I questioned whether I had done the right thing. If not, it would have been better to remain silent, to keep everything as it was. These doubts arose mainly at night, when the silence of the house seemed greater than before. I had to face these questions without backing down. At the same time, something inside me remained firm. Even though I felt the possibility of loss, I couldn't regret it. There was a sense of integrity that I had never experienced before. For the first time, I was whole, even if it cost comfort. Some reactions surprised me. One person approached in a different, more careful way. He asked my opinion in a simple situation, as if he were testing a new way of relating to me. That touched me more than any apology. Others, however, remained on the defensive. They avoided certain subjects, kept a polite distance. I had to accept that not everyone was ready to deal with the change. And for the first time, I accepted it without trying to please or correct it. The silence after the truth is different from the silence before. It hurts, but it doesn't go away. It scares, but it doesn't cancel it out. I was learning to live with this new space, without automatically filling it with concessions. Deep down, I knew that something irreversible had happened. Even though some relationships were never the same again, I wasn't either. And for the first time, this did not seem to me a loss, but a late start. After all that was said and the silence that followed, I began to notice something new in me. It was not happiness in the ordinary sense of the word, nor a sense of victory. It was simpler and, at the same time, more profound. I felt whole. For the first time, there wasn't a part of me being left behind. Loneliness appeared at times, it's true. There were quieter days than before, fewer invitations, fewer conversations. But this loneliness was different from the one I carried all my life. It didn't come from the annulment, it came from the transition. Of the space that opens up when something old ceases to exist. I started to live better with myself. I started to pay attention to what I felt, what I wanted, what bothered me. I didn't always say everything, but I also didn't pretend that everything was okay when it wasn't. This simple recognition changed my way of existing. I learned that speaking up doesn't guarantee acceptance, but it does guarantee dignity. I learned that silence can protect for a while, but it takes a very high price when it becomes the rule. And, above all, I learned that it is never too late to realize this, even at the age of 70. Some relationships have changed for the better. Others fell by the wayside. I had to accept both things without blaming myself. Not every leave is a loss. Sometimes, it's just the end of a role that no longer makes sense to continue playing. Today, when someone asks my opinion, I answer. Even if it's simple, even if it's different. My voice still trembles sometimes, but it exists. And this is already a huge achievement for someone who has spent his whole life keeping silent. I think a lot about the time that has passed. In everything I failed to say, in everything I accepted without question. Not with bitterness, but with conscience. I did what I knew how to do at that moment. Now, I do it differently because I know more. If I could leave a message for those who are listening to my story, it would be this: don't wait for your body to get tired, your soul to weigh, or time to pass too much to listen. Prolonged silence is not a virtue. It's survival. And surviving is not the same as living. Some truths really wait a lifetime to be told. I know that now. But I also know that, even if they are said late, they still liberate. They still reorganize. They still give back something essential. Today, at 70, I finally said what everyone pretended not to see. And, for the first time, I don't feel late. I feel present. If this story touched something in you, share this video. Not only as a personal account, but as a reflection of patterns that silence people for decades without them realizing it. By sharing, you turn this story into a gesture of solidarity, taking these words to those who still believe they need to be silent to belong. I'll stay here reading every comment. Tell me what city or country you're watching from, and what part of that story stuck with you. Your words matter more than you think to me.